if the left were ever to be stuck in a situation where they were being completely oppressed, like there was a violent insurgence against the left, which could happen any fucking day, it seems like sometimes. If that were the case, then because of the left's, especially the liberal left's distaste for guns, most of them would be slaughtered pretty easily. That can be scary too. Now I know that's a little bit of a reach, like as far as stuff may not come to that. Like maybe people think that's hyperbolic, but it's really not. It seems like these days. Something I've noticed over the past few years in the leftist community at large, as well as with my personal views, is that um, I used to be a lot more anti-gun than I am right now. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. My main reason is the absolute absurdity and uncertainty of the past 3 or so years. Well, actually, since 2016, to be honest, since the beginning of 2016. Um, so throughout Trump's uh, presidency, I would say probably about halfway through it. So I'd say about 2018, maybe. Yeah, so that would be about 4 years that my opinion started to change on that. I've always thought, I grew up around guns. I grew up around hunting and stuff like that from the area I lived in. And I always kind of, I guess, didn't think of guns one way or another when I was younger. I went hunting with my brother a couple of times, and I've killed an animal. I didn't like it, so I didn't really get into the hunting thing or anything like that. I do remember growing up in some kind of crazy neighborhoods where there was gun violence at times, and I remember my mom being afraid of us sitting on the porch sometimes and stuff like that. So I mean, I've always had a kind of a weird relationship with that growing up, or really none at all. There was never a gun in our house or anything like that. But I did, like I said, my brother, who's a bit older than me, he had rifles, and so we went hunting. I didn't really hold a handgun until I was 21, I think. Yeah, I probably held one, but I didn't really shoot one until I was 21, and that was at a range. The whole point is though is that I've never really had an issue with guns before prior to, I'd say, the last 10 years or so, when you started seeing a lot of mass shootings, and it started becoming more prevalent as body cam footage came out that there was massive gun violence against people of color and by the police themselves, and not just people of color but poor people in general have been subject to gun violence from the police. So that really turned me off, to say the least. And I became pretty militantly like not anti-gun completely. I know that's never going to happen in this country, but I wanted a lot stricter rules on guns. And I still think that there needs to be stricter rules. I think that it's a good thing to have a way to protect yourself. I don't think it's a great thing to have a weapon that can slaughter 47 people in a period of 10 seconds, or, that can cause terror like they do, like some of those automatic and semi-automatic weapons do. However, with that said, I've started to want a gun myself, simply because of the divisiveness and the anger and vitriol in this country. And simply because it seems like with COVID and Trump being president, kind of drove everybody fucking crazy in one way or another. So it's been on my mind that's something that I've thought about a lot lately. Um, but I did want to go over a couple of articles that kind of talked about the larger issues with guns and how leftists are kind of adopting guns, but in a different way from how right wingers do. So let's take a look at this. If others have rifles, we'll have rifles. Why U.S. leftist groups are taking up arms. Defend equality. That's kind of a badass hat, to be honest. Just saying. The van lumbered down one of Seattle's many steep hills. A half dozen people packed inside, but despite the heat, most wore long pants and boots, and several sported black hoodies. The atmosphere was subdued, except for the occasional joke. It wasn't so much tension as seriousness. There was work to be done. The people in the van are members of the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club. PSJB. That's why would you make an acronym like that? It just makes no sense. Their stated aim is to fight white supremacy and build community defense in America's Pacific Northwest, and their presence has become a fixture of protests in the Seattle and Tacoma areas, where the group is often invited to provide security against right-wing aggression. Based as fuck. I like it. The night before, several of them had been called to library in nearby Renton, Washington, where a drag story time hour, an event series in which a local drag queen or drag king reads to children in a library or bookstore, was being disrupted by right-wing protesters. The protesters, who opposed the event as immoral, held up signs equating drag with pedophilia. I fucking hate people who do that. And screamed shame, shame at the parents and their kids. Among them were members of the Proud Boys' violent right-wing street gang and 3%ers militia who were open carrying firearms. Okay, the first thing I've got to say about this is that they were open carrying firearms around a child. Around several children, as a matter of fact. That is probably the most amoral thing you can do, is to go to a place where children are being read to and have firearms, out open carrying to threaten them. So, of course, what are you going to do? You got to have people there to protect in those situations. Which is, I think, what we're about to read about. The Northwest has been at the center of tense political clashes over the last 2 years. The area is an adopted home base for the far-right group like Patriot Prayer, Identity Europa, American Identity Movement, and the Proud Boys, who have organized numerous marches that have ended in violence. In response, a range of leftist groups have organized self-defense groups and, in doing so, present gun ownership as a way to protect themselves and others. Now, the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club was en route to Seattle's Trans Pride March. In the weeks prior, word spread that a number of white supremacist groups had planned to disrupt the celebration. Hearing this, the club reached out to the organizers of the event, the Gender Justice League, and offered to assist with security or to provide escorts. God, these guys are badass. All right. So what are you going to do if there's people there with guns threatening you? Hire a fucking leftist fucking base security force. That's what you should do. Jesus. We need more stuff like this in my area. It's not going to happen, though. Brooke Wiley, the head of security for the Gender Justice League, in charge of overseeing the 101-person security detail for the event, did some research on the club. She told them the event had a policy of having no open carry, that is, no visible weapon, which they were fine with. She accepted their offer. Police were also present, but many marginalized groups do not trust them to provide protection at public events, especially when far-right groups are involved. Yes, because the police, a lot of them, are far-right. I wouldn't be surprised if several police officers in this area are either affiliated with or actually in the Proud Boys themselves. Each member showed up with a concealed handgun. We do our actions proportional to the threat. So when other people are out with rifles, we'll be out with rifles, the group's de facto spokesperson explained. In this case, we don't want to appear threatening for the people that we're trying to protect and support. We want this to be a happy atmosphere, especially for a population that may have faced gun violence on the streets just for being who they are. It's a good point, and a lot of leftists aren't pro-gun whatsoever. So that could be a situation too. This scenario, in which armed community groups are working together to patrol a pride event and protect it from other malicious and potentially armed groups, is becoming more and more common. There are more guns than people in America, approximately 393 million in a country of 328 million people. An average of 34,501 people died each year from firearms in 2018. 992 of those deaths were the result of police shootings. So I feel like we're at a crossroads with gun culture in America. I think that leftists are starting to understand that we're giving the stupidest fucking people all of the power by having them be the only ones with the guns. Having people who are less than smart. I mean, you see it all the time. You see kids getting shot with their parents' guns because the parents left the gun in the back seat because they're fucking crazy. They're fucking red, white, and blue flag Glock 9 sitting next to their fucking 4-year-old. Shit like that happens all the time. And then they seem to talk about proper gun usage and stuff. It's the way that they are pro-gun is separate from the way that many leftists are becoming pro-gun. And I'll talk about that more later. And the memory of the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016 when 49 people were killed in a mass shooting at a gay nightclub in Florida is still hanging heavily over the LGBTQ community. Though throughout the day, Puget Sound members stood watch over sections of the park, staying connected via walkie-talkies. "Thank you for being here" was a common refrain from marchgoers, as were inquiries on how to join. The group has a several month-long vetting process and probationary period for prospective recruits. That's fucking smart too, man. See, this is why leftists are responsible with guns and things like. They don't want an infiltration into their group. They don't want somebody who's gung-ho, who's just gonna fly off the handle and shoot somebody they're not supposed to, or start an altercation. It's a very good thing to do. Unlike some of the other masked anti-fascist groups at a march that day, the Puget Sound John Brown Gun Club consider themselves to be an above-ground organization and choose not to cover their faces. Part of the reason we don't cover our faces is that we don't want to present as though we're a militia, Foz, a longtime member, explained. We are not. We want to build relationships with people in our community. We want to be appear approachable. Yeah, you don't see this from gun clubs or militias on the right. There's not ever... They don't give a shit about that. Like, that's not something that they care about, right? While the group has not used deadly force, a former member of the group, William Van Sprossen, recently made headlines when he was killed by police after trying to set fire to ICE vehicles in a parking lot outside the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington, a private immigration detainment facility. Oh, ICE. They didn't even fucking capitalize that. I was like, ICE vehicles? What are you talking about, ICE vehicles? That's supposed to be capitalized. It's a fucking acronym. Jesus. There's been a couple of typos in this. That's the one that got me, though. You don't want to be the Antifa cop. Gun control advocates are quick to point out that More guns often means more violence, no matter the intent behind them. A recent Stanford's university study challenged that long-standing conservative view that more guns equals less crime, finding that adopted right-to-carry laws, which legalize concealed carry, saw a 13 increase in violent crime over 10 years. Yeah, I mean, it makes complete sense that the more guns, the more crime, right? I don't see where there's a logical like disconnect here. If somebody has a gun on them as opposed to sitting in their nightstand for protection when they're at home for home invasions or whatnot, for somebody who carries it on them, whether it's concealed or not, means that they'll have an opportunity to use the gun. And more people with the opportunity to use the gun, some good, some bad, there's going to be more violence with guns. It doesn't matter. Washington state's relatively loose gun laws mean that even those with a minimal training are able to show up to public events armed, which has potentially lethal implications. At a Milo Yiannopoulos rally at the University of Washington in 2017, an anti-fascist protester was shot in the stomach by a Trump supporter named Elizabeth Hokoana, who then claimed self-defense. If convicted, she faces up to 15 years in prison. You never hear about this stuff happening with people on the left. And then she tries to claim self-defense. It's crazy. This is the context in which an armed community defense group has been invited to protect trans pride event. The thinking goes that since there are already guns everywhere and the people who want to hurt minority groups are often heavily armed, their side may as well have guns too. When asked about how they would react if a survivor of gun violence came up and confronted them about their decision to bring guns into a public protest space, the Puget Sound Gun Club members say that they would approach the situation with empathy. A member of the Seraphiad pointed to their own history with gun violence as a starting point. See, I love it. Empathy. That's what is needed in this situation. Empathy. If you have a good amount of empathy, you're going to be less likely to use a gun, and you're going to be more sympathetic with people when you're considering what you say to them when they've been victims of gun violence, which will help your argument in the long run, right? For many other left-leaning organizations, guns remain a difficult topic. The Second Amendment has attained almost religious significance to some conservative gun owners. While gun control has become a defining issue for centrists and liberals, the opinions of those on the more radical left vary. So that tends to be the thing. The people who are more on the socialist, anarchist, communist side, even democratic socialists, seem to be more in favor of guns these days. The Democratic Socialists of America, for example, responded to an interview requesting for this piece by saying, "The DSA has no comment on gun controls or the Second Amendment. Our members represented a diversity of viewpoints on this topic," which makes sense. Others have been more forthcoming. Patrick Blanchfield, the author of a forthcoming book on guns in the left called Gun Power, doesn't specifically oppose the idea of armed self-defense, but he sees it as a potential danger to both the individuals as well as a broader group of the community, referencing the government's brutal assaults on the Black Panthers as a historical example. That's true too, but that doesn't mean... So, if the left were ever to be stuck in a situation where they were being completely oppressed, like there was a violent insurgence against the left, which could happen any fucking day, it seems like sometimes. If that were the case, then because of the left's, especially the liberal left's, distaste for guns, most of them would be slaughtered pretty easily. That can be scary too. Now I know that's a little bit of a reach, like as far as stuff may not come to that. Like maybe people think that's hyperbolic, but it's really not, it seems like these days. Blanchfield also sees an issue with the way armed groups have the potential to inadvertently replicate existing oppressive structures. You don't want to be the Antifa cop, he explains. For example, I would need some convincing that armed leftists didn't shoot partners at a rate substantially lower than non-leftists. I mean, that's a good point. There were swastikas in my kid's park. The Puget Sound chapter is a part of a long American leftist tradition of armed groups, from the Black Panthers to current groups like the Redneck Revolt. The Socialist Rifle Association, Trigger Warning, Queer and Trans Gun Club, and Los Angeles Black Coyote Collective. 21 members turned up that day. Nick Faza and a member who goes by Reverend were joined by Kat, a diminutive, self-described soccer mom, quiet, serious vixen with strawberry blonde hair and orange knee socks, Duke, the group's stocky, bearded founder, and Shannon, a civil rights attorney and constitutional law professor. That's a pretty interesting group of people, to be honest. Like a leftist soccer mom, some guy named Reverend. I feel like groups on the right that are gun clubs are pretty typecast, if you know what I mean. It's hard to tell them apart. There are plenty of anarchists among their ranks, but there are also people like Shannon who feel strongly about the Second Amendment and who are more interested in working within existing frameworks than tearing them down. There's power in the knowledge of the Constitution, she explains. It's okay to be a knowledgeable person whose politics are left of center, and willing to understand and fight back within the legal framework. It's pretty base too. Yeah, most soccer moms don't say things like that, especially right wing soccer moms. So Duke, a lifelong anarchist who founded the Seattle chapter in 2017, describes himself as having retired from activism following the birth of his son in 2012. He did normal progressive Seattle dad things like taking his family back to Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15 rallies until 2017, when he was inspired to act following the election of Donald Trump, and more specifically by the proliferation of hate crimes that plagued Seattle during its lead up. So, it's kind of interesting how there are groups that came out of this from Trump's reign of terror on this country that were good things. I mean, like you get backlash, right? So you got these leftist gun groups that are coming out of it, and that's exactly what I was saying before. It kind of there's a sea change, and especially on the farther left, on their opinion on guns, and it's because of the threat of fascism that is there that has never been there before in our lifetime. After Charlottesville, there was this recognition that there has to be somebody who's not on the right, who's willing to be in places that law enforcement either isn't willing to be, or where law enforcement is supporting fascists, Shannon explains. When you see law enforcement escorting Nazi groups in parades in places like DC or Detroit, you realize that there's a space to be filled by people who are confident in their skill as gun owners, but whose bigger mission is community defense and protection. It's so fucking based, man. I'm really, really digging the whole idea of this, the whole motto behind it, the whole mission statement. It's definitely something that I could get behind as far as gun rights are concerned. For Vixen, the decision to join came from threats of right-wing extremism poses to her identity. A trans woman who grew up shooting guns off her front porch in Indiana, she spoke about the toxic culture she had encountered at many gun ranges and the obligation she felt to protect her queer community. Today I'm a trans woman at Trans Pride, so I feel like I'm personally able to step in front of and put myself in front of people who are being attacked or harassed, or just try to de-escalate the situation, which is always the goal. Which is unlike many right-wing militias and things whose goal is to incite violence. So that is definitely something that's good about people on the left owning guns. See, this is just. I'm glad that there are finally some open discussion on the left about guns in general. Like I said, I was right there with everybody for the most part after so many school shootings and stuff, and I still think, like I said, that needs to be some major changes in gun laws. That there needs to be some more hurdles to actually purchasing a gun, right? But if the right's going to fucking own arsenals, even their 10-year-old kids own arsenals, it's probably a good idea in the political climate that we're in, that we be able to protect ourselves. I didn't want to read through this whole article, so I wanted to go over a couple of other things that I found on Reddit here that pertain to the same subject. What is your opinion on leftists, progressives, liberals, etc., who are in favor of owning gun rights? So, just a couple of interesting things I saw here. I can speak for myself as a liberal gun owner. I inherited a bunch of guns. I've bought a couple myself. I enjoy shooting them. I'm a mechanical engineer, so I nerd out on the engineering aspect of them. See, yeah, that's another thing, man. We got all the engineers and nerds on our side. We can nerd out about the best way to be safe with guns and the mechanical uses of them, so they don't, you know, misfire or whatnot. Such a simple concept, but they can be so complicated. With that said, gun violence in the U.S. is ridiculous. I've been saying this for years that if a two-way crowd doesn't make some concessions, then they'll end up with something a lot worse. Conservatives have given absolutely no solutions to gun violence. Even the ones that say it's a mental health issue don't do anything to advocate for mental health. Yeah, this is fucking true. I hate it when there's always after a mass shooting. First of all, they say, oh, this isn't a time to talk about legislation right now. This is a time for mourning. They do this all the fucking time, right? And then when it comes time to talk about legislation, they say, oh, well, this is a mental health issue. It's not a gun control issue. It's a mental health issue. But then we say, okay, well, maybe we should have a system where everybody has free at the point of access healthcare and mental health care. They're like, oh no, we couldn't. How we're gonna pay for that? Blah 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 blah. So it's a roundabout thing. They're never going to be good with doing anything about gun violence in this country, even when they say they want to do something about mental health. They're not. They don't care. I'm in favor of researching the causes of gun violence and acting accordingly. I suspect a lot of it comes down to socioeconomic economic factors, education, healthcare, as well as easy access to firearms. I think common sense gun legislation like universal background checks are also a no-brainer. Yeah, that's like the most simple thing that we can do. If a classroom full of 5 to 6 year olds get murdered and we don't do anything about it, maybe we deserve to get our guns taken away. And that's from a gun owner, you know. That's responsible gun ownership right there. And that's what it looks like. What do you think about assault weapon bans? I personally think the whole term is misleading. You can't fully ban them for the prior reason. And finally, even if you could, it would be treating the symptoms, not the disease. Oh, well, first, easy access to guns is the first problem. So it's more like treating one of the causes. You mean one of the symptoms? Yeah, like treating one of the symptoms. I would assume that's what they meant. Second, I'm torn on them. We know that legislators are terrible at defining what they are, and people will find workarounds to loosely defined elements of an assault weapon. Yet assault rifles are almost always involved with the worst mass shootings in this country. This is true. They need to be better at defining their language on these things, like talking about bump stocks, talking about any gun. You could be even more specific. Any gun that has a rate of fire of this is not legal within city limits, or it's not legal to own unless you are, in the military when they have those. Well, no, you can't own them at home, but you can have them in the military. You know what I mean? So those are a couple of things that are no brainers to do. The FBI tracks weapon homicides by weapon types, and handguns are responsible for the overwhelming majority of gun murders, like 80 to 90%, compared to the rifles of 4 to 5%. And that's not just AR-15s, but all rifles. Yes, but here's the thing: this loses the nuance, that which is the fact that mass shootings are a thing that happen, right? And so this amount of gun violence would probably be reduced quite a bit if there wasn't guns with a rate of fire that could kill, 100 people in just a couple of minutes, right? There's been up to like 47 people killed in one school shooting. I was at Parkland, or I can't remember exactly which one it was, but I think that was the record there. And it all happened in a matter of minutes. right? So this is kind of misleading in saying that, uh, it's all handguns. Because yeah, handguns, like, you kill individuals or maybe a couple of people with a handgun, whereas with a semi-automatic rifle assault weapon, you can kill fucking 40 people in 2 minutes, right? So there is something to be said there. I'm a pro-gun liberal who owns guns, grew up with guns hunting, and goes shooting at the shooting range. But I also passionately believe in reasonable restrictions, regulations, laws surrounding guns. Being pro-gun doesn't mean that I like the toxic gun culture that a lot of people have fallen into. I think that the constant brushing off of the very real problem with gun violence and dismissing any attempt to properly address it is idiotic. Very well said. So I think this should be a thing. I think this should be more of a thing where more leftists are out there showing people exactly what responsible gun ownership is. And more leftists should own guns. It's just something that I'm more of an advocate for these days. I used to think more guns, more gun violence. Yeah, of course. But at the same time, you see that maybe we can set a better example. Not only that, but if something really shitty does happen in this country where militia groups start killing people just because they think they're socialists or leftists or whatever, then it's going to be good to have some sort of way to protect yourself. And not only that, but I think that there is something to be said about the amount of right-wing terrorism in this country, right? You're already seeing it. You're seeing groups that are becoming more and more militant, more and more violent. And it's a scary, scary world we live in. But I think the thing is that I think that leftists would be better gun owners than conservatives, and probably are in many, many cases. Uh, because we understand the power of such a fucking weapon. We understand that when you point that at somebody, you could potentially be taking their life and taking everything from them. And not only do we work more based upon empathy, I think, for the most part, than a lot of people on the right, and work a lot less from a place of hatred and fear, we're going to be less likely to make shitty mistakes with guns. It just seems like something that's pretty cut and dry to me. It seems like a lot of people, especially far right extremist people, want to kill somebody. They want to do it. They're hoping to. That's why they want an arsenal. And that's why they are so antagonistic as well. So this is something that we need to think about more as leftists, I think. We really need to make sure that we're giving some thought to being responsible gun owners ourselves, because the right sure as shit are not responsible. If they're going to abuse the Second Amendment, we should at least be able to utilize it. If you're a leftist, don't be afraid to believe that you can be a gun owner and be responsible about it and not contribute to the toxic gun culture that's in this country. Because who knows, someday we may need to band together in defense of this country from fascism, in the way future, on Roblox, whatever.